Now, a look at U.S. intelligence activities in Central Europe after the Second World War. Last month, the Central Intelligence Agency sponsored this forum. Several former agents describe post-war intelligence and their roles within it.
First is James Critchfield. He is an honor ROTC graduate of the University of North Dakota in 1939. James Critchfield took a regular Army commission, went on active duty, and served throughout the Second World War as an armor officer, with great distinction, in campaigns in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. I think he once told me that in all of that service, he never actually heard of OSS. After the war, the Army sent him, he can deny that if you deny. After the war, the Army sent him for a year's graduate study at Columbia University, but in the spring of 1946, he returned to Europe as chief of the counterintelligence for the American occupation army in Germany. He found the intelligence community in Germany at that time close to a disaster. He had an opportunity to do something quite different, which turned out quite well. In 1947, 1948, he went to Austria, set up a centralized U.S. intelligence effort there. In 1948, he joined CIA, was sent to Germany to develop the first Soviet operations base. He was almost immediately diverted to look at the Army's, what was called then the Operation Rusty, the Gehlen Organization. For almost 8 years, he was a CIA officer responsible for the Gehlen Organization, and a topic which he'll tell us more about shortly. After returning to Washington, he served 2 years as chief of the Directorate of Plan's East European Division. Later, was the first National Intelligence Officer for Energy, had a distinguished career. Since retiring, he has been and is about to complete a book on Germany's transition from enemy to ally, based largely on his personal experiences. And so without any further ado, let me begin with the first speaker and ask Mr. Critchfield.
Ken, thank you very much. I thank you for your very precise and accurate description of how I got into the intelligence business. It's also a tremendous pleasure to be here with these gentlemen aligned on my right who represent most of my life, one way or another. In 10 minutes, I can only give you some very pointed highlights. In 1944, President Roosevelt made a decision to assign to his Secretary of War and the Joint Chiefs of Staff the responsibility for the occupied areas after the war. He initially did this for a period of 6 months. As we all know, this went on much longer than that. And in practical terms, in Germany, it was, as Ken has stated, a 10-year experience. I do regard the whole experience in American intelligence in Germany after the war as very much of a learning period. The intelligence community was badly led by the command echelons of the occupation. They knew very little about intelligence and paid very little attention to it, but the command structure was extremely faulty, and I'll touch on that in a moment, and contributed to a decade in which we had a essentially uncoordinated, divided intelligence community. There were other factors, however. When I joined CIA, I immediately noticed that there was a deep cultural influence in CIA that was quite different from that which I had experienced as a very conventional regular Army officer. Bill Quinn, in his book, which has been mentioned, gives an excellent analysis of his impression of that when he was assigned to SSU. At the end of the war, there was virtually no American intelligence effort that was focused on Germany. When Bill Quinn formed SSU, this was one of the first things that he observed. So he reached out overseas someplace and got Harry Rosicki to come back to Washington and assigned him the task of organizing the initial SSU Soviet effort. It was at that time that I entered the picture, and having met Dick Helms and a few others in Europe, I came back and made an enormous decision to leave the regular Army and join the Central Intelligence Agency and take on the task of organizing Harry Rosicki's first operational base overseas, which perchance was to be in Munich. But as you heard, I no sooner got there, spent 3 or 4 months doing this, and when very casually I was asked to, in addition to my other duties, on the north side of Munich, would I go out the south side of Munich and take a look at an organization in the village of Pullach that was called Operation Rusty, about which I knew a good deal, having served in Germany and in Austria, and having experienced rusty agents going by in the field without knowing anything about where they came from or what they were supposed to be doing. General Seibert, who was the first G2 at the end of the war, was assigned to USFET, the United States Forces European Theater, which was created in the summer of 1945 when Schaeff was eliminated, and General Eisenhower became the theater commander. And as the G2 of 12th Army Group, General Seibert immediately became his G2, and he very effectively exploited the power and the prestige of General Eisenhower to quickly bring under his own control all of the intelligence activities of any consequence that were going on in Germany at the time. I would exclude SSU from that because it was doing so little that it did not really figure very significantly in those early days. I can tell you that as chief of the counterintelligence branch at the Occupation Army down in Heidelberg, I found a fellow named Gordon Stewart and another fellow named Crosby Lewis, and they used to come by my office occasionally, but not very often, and occasionally had problems, but I did not perceive that they were at that time really a significant factor. The two big organizations in Germany that were simply overwhelming the what we came to call the intelligence jungle, because that's what Germany was in the first 2.5 years after the war. The two organizations were what became the Gehlen Organization, that was being run out of Oberursel by General Seibert, and about which he was extremely protective and extremely secretive. He told the Army of Occupation, which was only an hour down the Autobahn from Frankfurt, absolutely nothing about this operation. He also insisted on total control of the only major counterintelligence corps unit in Germany at that time, the 970th CIC, and refused to share either its the direction of it or its product with the commanding general of the Occupation Army. When I got to Pullach, I took a good look in a very superficial way, because it was a casual exercise, I assure you, and I found that it was immediately apparent that there were two things that the Gehlen Organization did pretty well. Their evaluation, their research and analysis with regard to Soviet armed forces was very impressive. And it should have been, because they were the only organization in the world that had been operating directly against the Soviet Union, Soviet armed forces, without interruption since the beginning of the attack of the Soviet Union in 1941. We were getting a very good bargain there, because we did not have in the United States intelligence community any real competence to deal with the Soviet armed forces and the military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union, which was out there waiting for us to deal with. So we got a good bargain there. I found that all of the analysts and all of the consumers of the intelligence in the Gehlen Organization were positive, friendly, and helpful. I found all of the operators in Germany, including CIC, military intelligence, and most of the operating bases of CIA, were just as hostile and antagonistic as they could be. And so when I settled into Pullach in 1949, I sort of decided it was time to circle the wagons and wait for the attacks. They all came in the course of the next 5 years. I would like to give you just a little vignette. 1949, you remember, was Sino-Soviet agreement. First Soviet bomb was tested. NATO was founded. The German Federal Republic was created. Adenauer became chancellor. General Clay went home. John McCloy came over and became High Commissioner. And last and not least, CIA on the 1st of July took over the Gehlen Organization. I found that we had gotten more than we had bargained for. I knew that the Gehlen Organization was, in fact, a well-rounded German intelligence service about which we could not quickly make a qualitative judgment, but it was quite clear to us that it had certain competence in fields in which the United States was interested. But I also found we had something else in Polack that nobody had told me about. After I'd been there a short time, a very quiet little gentleman who I'd met as Dr. Horn, head of their research and analysis staff, invited me to come by and have a glass of wine with him one night, and what he had to say was that he, who was Adolf Heusinger, who had been head of the operations division of the German General Staff during the whole war, he quietly explained to me in a very low-key way that he and General Hans Speidel, well-known German general, and General Hermann Furch, who had commanded the 1st German Army at the end of the war, had been closely studying the situation, the balance of power in Europe, and the bottom line was that they were preparing a position to present to a future German government on how Germany might be integrated in a Western alliance headed by the United States. That came as something of a surprise to me. So we got the next year, and fortunately we went up in January and we gave John J. McCloy an exhaustive briefing on this. He sent his director of intelligence, Ben Shute, down. We gave him the full story. We went through that, and then came the Korean War and everything changed. Immediately all my problems of getting enough money out of Dick Helms to pay for the groceries in Polack ended because the value of the Gehlen Organization and its product very quickly was enhanced by the Korean War. Then, 4 days after the Korean War started, Adenauer reached out through his state secretary, a man named Dr. Hans Globke, and got in touch with Gehlen. We took no initiative, we played no role in that, and then 2 weeks later he reached out and got in touch with Adolf Heusinger. And that began the relationship with the German Federal Republic, with the Gehlen Organization, and out of it they got two things. They got the Bundeswehr and they got the Bundesnachrichtendienst. They both were directly an outgrowth of that experience in Polack. I think the other thing I would say is that in 1950, the Soviet Union clearly made a decision to give high priority to penetrating the Gehlen Organization and the German government, particularly the national security system of the German government. They did that for the next 3 or 4 years, and by 1953-54, they really had the Gehlen Organization and most of the new offices in Bonn pretty well taped. And so they started a massive propaganda operation that was designed to destroy the Gehlen Organization, and if they could, to slow down the movement of the German Federal Republic into the alliance. Now, exactly at the same time, in 1950, the United States Army made a decision that it was going to penetrate the Gehlen Organization and all of the national security elements in Bonn. And whereas the Soviets did it with a Colonel Max operating out of Dresden and later Karlshorst, the Army did it with a Colonel Thomas operating out of Region 3 of 66, the 970th, later 66 CIC. Now this went on during all of the next 5 years, from 1950 to 1955. In 1954, the United States Army launched a major conspiracy to destroy the Gehlen Organization and get Chancellor Adenauer to redirect his attention to creating German intelligence within the German armed forces and the new incipient Ministry of Defense, which was in the process of developing. This effort was carried out. It was a conspiracy. It was the documents that I have on it are filled with references to secret meetings, secret emissaries, confidential meetings, and be sure you burn this letter after you've read it. Why they did this remains something of a mystery to me. I do not know at what point the decision was made to penetrate the Gehlen Organization, but it was made in about 1950, and it was carried out very efficiently by CIC. The end of this story is that when the conspiracy did not work, because Speidel and Heusinger replied in a very specific way to the overture from the G2 in Washington that they would not play this game. So the next year, as many of you know from having read many versions on it, General Trudeau, not content with the effort he had made, he took a direct run at the Chancellor when he was visiting Washington in the summer of 1955, and basically made the same arguments that had been made in the approach to Speidel and Heusinger. When that didn't work, The next thing that happened was Gehlen approached me in 2 weeks, 3 weeks after that, and protested vehemently about the fact that the United States Counterintelligence Corps had been systematically engaged in penetration of his organization. That was a difficult one to handle. I reported, got no response whatsoever from anybody. And a month later, the principal agent of CIC was arrested by the German police for suspicion of working for the East Side. He was taken to prison where he immediately committed suicide, and this produced a big incident, and as far as I can judge, that finally brought the Army G2 to cancel its operation of penetrating the Gehlen Organization and the government of Chancellor Adenauer. Thank you very much. It seemed to me one of the most important things we did without planning it. After we had taken over the Gehlen Organization, we began to have visitors from the Air Force, the Army, from CIA, and very soon you had a stream of people arriving there for visitors. Bob Amory came, he was fascinated and sent some of his people over. Sherman Kent got deeply involved. Now out of this there evolved a dialogue that went on between, say, Adolf Heusinger and people like Maxwell Taylor, who came down once and spent 2 days with us. General Cabell came. And there were dozens and dozens of other generals came, stayed overnight, had dinners, met the Germans socially, and got briefed by the superb order of battle experts, which is the one asset that Gehlen had that was unsurpassed by anyone. Now, out of that, there grew a decade of high-level dialogue in a kind of a think tank atmosphere between a group of Germans and a group of Americans who were very involved in the formative period of the Western Alliance. And so when you got to the point where Adenauer was going to form a government and where the Germans were going to appear in NATO in uniform, you had a whole group of officers who had had a 10-year intimate dialogue with American officers from all three of the services and with CIA and with a good many political people. And I think that was a tremendous factor in getting the relationship between the Germans when they entered the Western Alliance, getting it off to the right start.